In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where the thin air carries both hope and death, a single radio transmission would shatter every assumption about courage, skill, and survival. The elite Navy SEALs, trained to expect the impossible, found themselves asking a question that would haunt them forever. Who brought down that helicopter? But nothing could have prepared them for what they saw next. Through the smoke and debris of a crashed aircraft, a figure emerged from the wreckage that defied everything they thought they knew about combat aviation. This is the true story of Captain Sarah Mitchell, whose extraordinary survival and split-second decisions in the cockpit would rewrite the rules of aerial warfare and prove that heroism knows no gender. What happened in those crucial moments above the Hindu Kush Mountains wasn't just about one pilot's fight for survival. It was about breaking barriers, defying odds, and showing that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the most impossible situations. This is her story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the military airfield at Bagram Air Base, Afghanistan. Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her helmet one final time as she ran through the pre-flight checklist for her UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter. The rhythmic whir of rotor blades from other aircraft created a familiar symphony that had become the soundtrack of her life over the past 18 months. Sarah had always known she was different from most pilots in her unit. At 28, she was one of only a handful of female helicopter pilots deployed in active combat zones. Her journey to this moment had been filled with challenges that her male counterparts never had to face. Growing up in rural Montana, she had learned to fly crop dusters with her father, a Vietnam veteran who never questioned her dreams of military aviation. While other girls her age were interested in typical teenage activities, Sarah spent her weekends at the local airfield, absorbing everything she could about aircraft mechanics and flight dynamics. The path to becoming a military pilot had been anything but easy. During flight training, she faced instructors who doubted her capabilities and fellow trainees who questioned whether she belonged in the cockpit of a military aircraft. Some believed that women lacked the physical strength and mental toughness required for combat aviation. Sarah proved them wrong time and again, graduating at the top of her class and earning the respect of those who initially doubted her abilities. Her deployment to Afghanistan had been voluntary. While many of her peers were assigned to the conflict zone, Sarah specifically requested the posting. She wanted to prove herself in the most challenging environment possible, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death for the soldiers she was tasked with supporting. Over the months, she had flown dozens of missions, from medical evacuations to supply runs, earning a reputation as one of the most skilled and reliable pilots in the theater. The mission briefing that morning had been routine. Intelligence reports indicated that a Navy SEAL team designated as Alpha Squad was conducting a reconnaissance operation in a remote valley approximately 60 miles northeast of the base. The terrain was particularly challenging, with steep mountain ridges and unpredictable weather patterns that made flying treacherous even under the best circumstances. The SEALs had been monitoring suspected Taliban activity in the area for several days and were scheduled for extraction at a predetermined landing zone. Sarah's Black Hawk was equipped with the latest defensive systems, including flare dispensers and electronic countermeasures designed to protect against enemy surface-to-air missiles. Her crew consisted of 3 other experienced personnel: Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, her co-pilot, and a veteran of multiple deployments, Sergeant First Class David Thompson, the crew chief responsible for aircraft maintenance and door gunner duties, and Corporal Amanda Johnson, a medic and communications specialist who had joined the crew just 2 months earlier. The team dynamics were crucial for successful operations. Rodriguez had been flying with Sarah for over a year and had developed complete trust in her abilities. Initially skeptical about flying with a female pilot, he had quickly learned that Sarah's skills exceeded those of many male pilots he had worked with throughout his career. Thompson, a career soldier with 15 years of service, brought invaluable experience in aircraft maintenance and tactical operations. Johnson, despite being the newest team member, had already proven herself during several challenging missions, including a medical evacuation under enemy fire that had saved the lives of 3 wounded soldiers. As Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection, she noticed the weather forecast showing potential for severe thunderstorms in the target area later that afternoon. Mountain weather in Afghanistan was notoriously unpredictable, with conditions changing rapidly due to the complex terrain and high altitude. She made mental notes about potential alternate landing zones and emergency procedures, a habit that had served her well throughout her military career. The mission timeline called for a morning departure, allowing the Black Hawk to reach the extraction point during optimal daylight hours when visibility was at its best. The SEAL team had been inserted 3 days earlier via a different route, and their extraction was critical to the success of the intelligence-gathering operation. Any delay could compromise not only the current mission, but also future operations in the region. Sarah's pre-flight routine was meticulous, a characteristic that had earned her the nickname Checklist Charlie among her peers. She inspected every system, from the main rotor assembly to the smallest electrical connections, ensuring that nothing was left to chance. Her attention to detail had prevented several potential mechanical failures during previous missions, and she maintained this discipline regardless of the pressure to expedite departure times. The intelligence briefing had revealed that enemy activity in the target area was minimal, with no recent reports of surface-to-air missile systems or significant anti-aircraft capabilities. However, Sarah had learned never to underestimate the resourcefulness of the enemy forces they faced. Taliban fighters had demonstrated remarkable adaptability throughout the conflict, often employing improvised weapons and tactics that caught coalition forces off guard. As the departure time approached, Sarah gathered her crew for a final mission briefing. She reviewed the flight route, identifying potential hazards and alternate courses of action should complications arise. The planned route would take them through a series of mountain valleys, using terrain masking techniques to minimize exposure to potential ground threats. The flight time to the extraction point was estimated at 45 minutes, with an additional 15 minutes allocated for the actual extraction procedure. Rodriguez plotted the navigation coordinates while Thompson checked the defensive systems and ammunition supplies. Johnson reviewed medical protocols and communication frequencies, ensuring that all equipment was functioning properly. The team's professionalism and attention to detail reflected the high standards expected of military aviation crews operating in combat environments. The Blackhawk's engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, and Sarah felt the familiar sensation of the aircraft coming alive beneath her hands. She had logged over 800 flight hours in the UH-60, and the helicopter had become an extension of her own body. Every vibration, every sound, every subtle change in performance registered in her consciousness, allowing her to detect potential problems before they became critical issues. As they lifted off from Bagram Air Base, Sarah couldn't have known that this mission would become the defining moment of her military career. The routine extraction operation was about to transform into a test of survival, skill, and determination that would challenge everything she had learned about flying and fighting in one of the world's most dangerous environments. The landscape below them changed from the relatively flat terrain surrounding the air base to the rugged mountains that dominated much of Afghanistan's geography. The Hindu Kush mountain range presented a formidable obstacle, with peaks reaching over 15,000 feet and weather patterns that could change from clear skies to zero visibility within minutes. Sarah maintained a steady course, following established flight corridors while remaining vigilant for any signs of potential threats. Communication with the SEAL team remained clear and consistent as they approached the target area. Alpha Squad reported that their reconnaissance mission had been successful, with valuable intelligence gathered about enemy movements and supply routes. The extraction would proceed as planned, with the helicopter landing at the designated coordinates for a quick pickup of the 6-member team. As they flew deeper into the mountains, Sarah noticed that the weather was beginning to deteriorate more rapidly than the forecast had predicted. Dark clouds were forming around the higher peaks, and wind patterns indicated the potential for severe turbulence. She made adjustments to their flight path, seeking routes that would provide better protection from the increasingly unstable atmospheric conditions. The final approach to the landing zone required navigating through a narrow valley with steep walls on both sides. This type of terrain presented significant challenges for helicopter operations, as it limited escape routes and increased vulnerability to ground-based threats. Sarah had successfully completed similar extractions dozens of times, but each mission required complete focus and precise execution. What none of them realized as they approached the extraction point was that their helicopter had been tracked by enemy spotters positioned throughout the mountain range. Intelligence reports had failed to identify a newly established Taliban cell that had moved sophisticated weapons into the area just 48 hours earlier. The trap that was about to unfold would test every aspect of Sarah's training, experience, and determination to survive. The first indication that something was wrong came from Corporal Johnson, whose trained ear detected the faint electronic signature of a radar system attempting to lock onto their aircraft. Her voice cut through the routine chatter on the internal communication system with an urgency that immediately commanded everyone's attention. The electronic warfare detection equipment began emitting a series of rapid beeps that every crew member recognized as the warning of an incoming surface-to-air missile threat. Sarah's reaction was instantaneous and based on hundreds of hours of combat training. She threw the Black Hawk into a sharp banking turn while simultaneously deploying chaff and flares designed to confuse incoming missiles. The helicopter's defensive systems activated automatically, but Sarah knew that their effectiveness depended largely on the skill of the pilot and the specific type of threat they were facing. The mountainous terrain that had provided concealment during their approach now became a liability, limiting her maneuvering options and potential escape routes. Rodriguez immediately began broadcasting emergency calls on multiple frequencies, attempting to alert other aircraft in the area and request immediate close air support. The protocols for dealing with surface-to-air missile threats were well established, but executing them effectively in the confined space of a mountain valley required exceptional piloting skills and perfect coordination between crew members. The Taliban fighters who had positioned themselves for the ambush had spent weeks studying coalition aircraft flight patterns and had chosen their location carefully. Their weapons included not only traditional rocket-propelled grenades, but also a sophisticated surface-to-air missile system that had been smuggled into Afghanistan through complex supply networks. The fighters had received extensive training on the weapons system and had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to demonstrate its effectiveness against coalition aircraft. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions along the ridge lines as automatic weapons fire erupted from concealed positions. The distinctive sound of bullets striking the helicopter's armored hull created a metallic percussion that mixed with the roar of the engines and the whine of the rotor blades. Thompson returned fire from his door gun position, but the steep angles and multiple threat locations made it difficult to suppress the enemy effectively. The first missile launched from a position approximately 800 meters to their north, its exhaust trail clearly visible against the rocky mountainside. Sarah had perhaps 3 seconds to react before the weapon would reach their location. Her training took over as she executed a combination of defensive maneuvers designed to defeat heat-seeking missiles. The Black Hawk dropped altitude rapidly while turning toward the missile, a counterintuitive move that placed the aircraft's cooler frontal aspect toward the incoming threat while deploying maximum flares. The missile detonated approximately 50 meters from the helicopter, its proximity fused trigger by the defensive flares rather than the aircraft itself. However, the explosion was close enough to cause significant damage to several critical systems. Sarah felt the controls become sluggish as hydraulic pressure began to drop, and warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel. The smell of smoke began to fill the cabin, indicating that electrical systems had been damaged by the blast. A second missile was already in the air before the first had detonated. This one launched from a different position that had been carefully coordinated with the initial attack. The Taliban fighters had learned from previous engagements with coalition aircraft and had developed tactics specifically designed to overwhelm defensive countermeasures through coordinated attacks from multiple angles. Sarah attempted to execute another defensive maneuver, but the helicopter's damaged systems were no longer responding normally. The flight controls felt heavy and unresponsive, and she could see fluid streaming from damaged hydraulic lines. Rodriguez was working frantically to diagnose the extent of the damage, while simultaneously trying to maintain communication with their base and other aircraft in the area. The second missile struck the helicopter's tail section with devastating effect. The explosion severed the tail rotor drive shaft and caused immediate loss of anti-torque control, sending the Black Hawk into an uncontrollable spin. Sarah fought desperately to regain control, using every technique she had learned about emergency procedures and auto-rotation landings, but the combination of battle damage and the confined mountain terrain made a controlled landing virtually impossible. Thompson had been thrown against the cabin wall by the force of the explosion and was bleeding from multiple lacerations caused by flying debris. Johnson immediately began providing medical assistance while attempting to maintain her communications duties. The crew's training in emergency procedures was being tested under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. As the helicopter spun toward the ground, Sarah made split-second decisions that would determine whether anyone survived the crash. She identified a relatively flat area approximately 200 meters ahead and attempted to use the remaining engine power and rotor momentum to reach that location. The technique, known as auto-rotation, requires precise timing and exceptional skill under normal circumstances. Attempting it with a battle-damaged aircraft while under enemy fire pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. The ground rushed up to meet them with terrifying speed. Sarah pulled back on the collective at the last possible moment, using the helicopter's remaining kinetic energy to cushion the impact. The Black Hawk struck the ground with tremendous force, the landing gear collapsing immediately and the fuselage sliding across the rocky terrain. Metal screamed against stone as the aircraft came to rest against a large boulder, its rotors shattered and engines smoking. The immediate aftermath of the crash was chaos. Sarah found herself hanging upside down in her harness, blood streaming from a head wound caused by flying debris. Her first thought was for her crew members, and she could hear groaning from the passenger compartment indicating that at least some of them had survived the impact. The smell of aviation fuel was strong, creating the immediate danger of fire that could consume the aircraft within minutes. Rodriguez was unconscious, suspended in his harness with blood visible on his flight suit. Sarah managed to release her own restraints and immediately began checking on her co-pilot's condition while simultaneously assessing the structural integrity of the aircraft. The cabin had been severely deformed by the impact, but the crew compartment had remained largely intact due to the helicopter's robust design and energy-absorbing features. Johnson was conscious, but trapped beneath equipment that had broken loose during the crash. She was calling for help while attempting to reach her medical supplies to treat Thompson, who appeared to have suffered serious injuries to his left arm and shoulder. The crew's survival training was being put to the ultimate test as they worked to extract themselves from the wreckage while remaining alert for continued enemy threats. The Taliban fighters who had successfully shot down the helicopter were already moving toward the crash site, intent on capturing any survivors and claiming credit for destroying an American aircraft. Their leaders had emphasized the propaganda value of such victories and had instructed their fighters to document any successful attacks against coalition forces. Sarah knew that their survival depended not only on getting out of the aircraft quickly, but also on evading enemy forces long enough for rescue teams to locate and extract them. The emergency locator beacon was transmitting their position, but it would take time for search and rescue aircraft to reach their remote location. During that time, they would be on their own in hostile territory with limited weapons and equipment. As she worked to free Rodriguez from his harness, Sarah could hear the sound of approaching voices speaking in Pashto, the local language used by many Taliban fighters. The enemy was closing in on their position, and she realized that they had very little time to escape the wreckage and find defensible positions. The next few minutes would determine whether the crew survived long enough to be rescued or whether they would become prisoners or casualties of the ongoing conflict. The crash site was surrounded by rocky terrain that could provide both concealment and defensive positions if they could reach it in time. Sarah made rapid assessments of each crew member's condition and began formulating a plan for their immediate survival. Her training as a pilot had not specifically prepared her for ground combat, but her determination to protect her crew would drive her to exceed every limitation she had previously accepted about her own capabilities. Sarah managed to extract Rodriguez from his harness just as he began to regain consciousness. His pupils were dilated, and he showed clear signs of concussion, but he was alive and responsive to her voice. Blood continued to flow from a deep gash on his forehead, but Johnson had managed to free herself from the debris and was already preparing medical supplies from her survival kit. The sound of approaching enemy fighters grew louder with each passing minute. Sarah estimated they had perhaps 5 minutes before the Taliban reached the crash site, and the crew's survival depended entirely on their ability to escape the wreckage and establish defensive positions among the rocky outcroppings that surrounded their location. The helicopter's fuel tanks had been punctured during the crash, creating a strong smell of aviation gasoline that posed an immediate fire hazard. Thompson was conscious, but in severe pain from his injured arm and shoulder. Despite his wounds, he had managed to retrieve his M4 carbine and 2 magazines of ammunition from his equipment bag. Johnson had located the crew's survival radio and was attempting to establish communication with rescue coordination centers while simultaneously treating Thompson's wounds with field dressings. Sarah took command of the survival situation with the same calm professionalism she had demonstrated throughout her piloting career. Her first priority was moving the crew away from the aircraft before enemy fighters arrived. The wreckage could explode at any moment if the leaking fuel came into contact with hot engine components or electrical sparks from damaged systems. Working together, they managed to extract their essential survival equipment, including weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, water, emergency rations, and communications equipment. Each crew member carried a personal survival kit, but the combined resources would need to sustain them for an unknown period in hostile territory while they waited for rescue forces to locate and extract them. The terrain surrounding the crash site consisted of large boulders and rocky formations that had been carved by centuries of erosion. Sarah identified a defensive position approximately 100 meters from the helicopter that would provide both concealment and fields of fire should they need to engage enemy forces. The location also offered multiple escape routes if their position became compromised. As they moved away from the wreckage, Sarah could see Taliban fighters approaching from 2 different directions. The enemy forces appeared to be conducting a careful advance, aware that downed aircrew members were typically armed and trained in survival and evasion techniques. The fighters were taking their time to ensure they could surround the crash site before beginning their search for survivors. Rodriguez was functioning despite his head injury, though Sarah remained concerned about the severity of his concussion. He was able to carry his weapon and move under his own power, but she noticed that his balance was affected and his responses were slightly delayed. Johnson continued to monitor his condition while establishing their defensive position among the rocks. The crew's survival radio crackled with transmissions from search and rescue coordination centers that had received their emergency beacon signal. Rescue aircraft were being launched from multiple locations, but the remote mountain terrain and continuing threat from enemy surface-to-air missiles complicated their response efforts. The nearest friendly forces were at least 30 minutes away by helicopter, assuming they could safely navigate to the crash site location. Sarah realized that their survival strategy needed to focus on evading enemy contact rather than engaging in direct combat. With 1 crew member seriously injured and limited ammunition supplies, they could not sustain a prolonged firefight against numerically superior enemy forces. Their best hope was to remain hidden until rescue aircraft could reach their location. The Taliban fighters reached the helicopter wreckage and began searching for the crew members they assumed were still trapped inside. Sarah could observe their activities from her concealed position and counted at least 8 enemy fighters, armed with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. The fighters appeared disappointed when they discovered the empty aircraft, and their leader began organizing search teams to locate the missing crew members. Johnson had successfully established radio contact with a rescue coordination center and was providing detailed information about their location and the crew's medical condition. She reported that they had evaded immediate capture, but were surrounded by hostile forces and would require armed escort for any extraction attempt. The rescue coordinators acknowledged the transmission and confirmed that armed helicopters were en route to provide support. Thompson's condition was deteriorating despite Johnson's medical treatment. He was losing blood from his wounds and showing signs of shock that could become life-threatening without proper medical intervention. Sarah made the difficult decision to risk radio transmission to update rescue forces about the urgent medical evacuation requirements for her injured crew chief. As the morning progressed, the Taliban search teams began expanding their search pattern outward from the crash site. Sarah realized that their current position would eventually be discovered, and she began planning for movement to alternate hiding places that would keep them ahead of the enemy's search efforts. The mountain terrain was both an advantage and a disadvantage, providing concealment but also limiting their mobility options. The crew heard the distant sound of approaching helicopters and initially felt relief that rescue forces had arrived. However, their hopes were quickly dashed when surface-to-air missiles were launched at the incoming aircraft, forcing them to retreat beyond the range of the enemy weapon systems. The rescue coordinators transmitted that they would need to eliminate the missile threat before attempting any extraction operations. Sarah's military training had not prepared her for the psychological challenges of survival in hostile territory while responsible for injured crew members. The weight of command decisions that could determine life or death for her team created stress levels she had never previously experienced. However, her determination to bring her crew home safely gave her strength that exceeded her own expectations. The search teams were getting closer to their position when Johnson spotted movement on a distant ridgeline that did not appear to be Taliban fighters. Using binoculars from her survival kit, she identified what appeared to be coalition forces moving carefully through the mountain terrain. The silhouettes and movement patterns were consistent with special operations personnel conducting reconnaissance of the crash site area. Sarah made the critical decision to risk exposing their position by attempting to signal the distant figures. Using a signal mirror from her survival kit, she flashed coded messages toward the ridgeline while monitoring Taliban fighter positions to ensure they would not be detected. The technique was dangerous because the reflected sunlight could also attract enemy attention to their location. The distant figures responded with their own signal mirror, confirming that they were indeed coalition forces and had observed the crew's location. Radio communication revealed that the personnel were members of Alpha Squad. The same Navy SEAL team at the Black Hawk had been scheduled to extract before being shot down. The SEALs had heard the helicopter crash and had moved to investigate and provide assistance to any survivors. Alpha Squad's team leader reported that they had been observing Taliban movements in the area and had identified the locations of enemy fighters and weapon systems. The SEALs possessed the training and equipment necessary to eliminate the surface-to-air missile threat that was preventing rescue aircraft from approaching the crash site. However, the operation would require careful coordination and precise timing to be successful. Sarah found herself in the unusual position of coordinating ground operations while maintaining responsibility for her injured crew members. The SEALs requested detailed information about Taliban positions and numbers based on her observations from the crash site area. Her pilot training in situational awareness and tactical recognition proved invaluable in providing accurate intelligence for the Special Operations Team. Thompson's medical condition continued to worsen despite Johnson's best efforts with limited field medical supplies. His blood pressure was dropping, and He was showing signs of internal bleeding that could not be treated effectively without hospital-level medical intervention. Time was becoming critical, and any rescue delay could result in the loss of a crew member who had survived the initial crash and enemy attack. The SEAL team leader developed a plan to eliminate the missile sites while simultaneously creating a diversion that would allow rescue helicopters to reach the crash site. The operation would require the downed aircrew to move to a new location that could serve as a landing zone for medical evacuation aircraft. Sarah would need to guide her injured crew across difficult terrain while avoiding detection by enemy search teams. As afternoon approached, the weather conditions that Sarah had noticed during their initial flight began to deteriorate significantly. Storm clouds were building around the mountain peaks, and the wind was increasing to levels that could make helicopter operations dangerous or impossible. The rescue window was narrowing, and any delay could force them to survive another night in hostile territory with a critically injured crew member. The SEAL team's assault on the missile positions began precisely at 1,430 hours, coordinated with the approach of 2 Apache attack helicopters that had been standing by beyond the range of enemy weapons. Sarah watched through her binoculars as Alpha Squad moved with lethal precision through the rocky terrain, eliminating Taliban fighters with suppressed weapons to maintain the element of surprise for as long as possible. The first surface-to-air missile site was neutralized within minutes of the operation's commencement. The SEALs had approached the position from an unexpected angle, using the mountainous terrain to mask their movement until they were close enough to engage with grenades and small arms fire. The explosion of the missile system created a mushroom cloud of smoke that was visible for miles, signaling to rescue aircraft that the threat had been eliminated. Sarah received radio instructions to move her crew to an alternate landing zone approximately 400 meters from their current position. The new location had been selected by the SEAL team leader based on its accessibility for rescue helicopters and defendability against enemy counterattacks. However, moving Thompson in his deteriorating condition across the rough terrain would be extremely challenging and potentially life-threatening. Rodriguez had recovered sufficiently from his concussion to assist with moving equipment and providing security during their movement to the new position. Despite his head injury, he insisted on carrying his share of the survival gear and maintaining his weapon in a ready condition. Johnson continued to monitor Thompson's vital signs while preparing him for transport across the difficult terrain. The crew fashioned an improvised stretcher using equipment from their survival kits and portions of the helicopter's cargo netting that Johnson had retrieved from the wreckage. Thompson remained conscious but was clearly in severe pain from his injuries and the blood loss he had sustained. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, indicating that his condition was deteriorating more rapidly than initially assessed. As they began their movement toward the landing zone, Sarah maintained continuous radio communication with both the SEAL team and the incoming rescue aircraft. The Apache helicopters were providing close air support, engaging Taliban reinforcements that were attempting to reach the crash site area. The sound of cannon fire and rocket explosions echoed through the mountain valleys as the attack helicopters systematically eliminated enemy positions. The terrain between their hiding place and the landing zone consisted of steep slopes covered with loose rocks and scattered boulders. Moving an injured person on an improvised stretcher required all 3 remaining crew members working together, with frequent stops to rest and check Thompson's condition. Each pause also provided opportunities to scan for enemy fighters who might have evaded the SEAL team's initial assault. Sarah's leadership during the movement demonstrated qualities that went far beyond her training as a helicopter pilot. She maintained morale through constant encouragement while making tactical decisions about route selection and security procedures. Her crew's trust in her abilities had been established during months of successful missions, and that confidence was crucial to their survival during this most challenging situation. The second missile site proved more difficult for the SEALs to neutralize due to its position on a high ridgeline that provided excellent observation of the surrounding area. The Taliban fighters manning the position had seen the destruction of the first site and were prepared for attack. Alpha Squad was forced to conduct a more methodical assault that required additional time and exposed them to greater risk from enemy fire. Thompson lost consciousness during the movement to the landing zone, his body no longer able to cope with the blood loss and trauma from his injuries. Johnson immediately checked his pulse and breathing, confirming that he was still alive, but in critical condition requiring immediate medical intervention. The crew increased their pace despite the difficult terrain, knowing that every minute of delay reduced Thompson's chances of survival. The landing zone selected by the SEAL team was a relatively flat area surrounded by rocky walls that would provide protection for rescue aircraft from ground fire. However, the space was barely large enough for a single helicopter, requiring exceptional piloting skills to land safely in the confined area. Sarah used a radio to brief the incoming rescue pilot about the landing zone's dimensions and potential hazards. As they reached the landing zone, Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of approaching Black Hawk helicopters. 2 aircraft were inbound, with one designated for medical evacuation and the other providing armed escort and additional personnel for security during the extraction. The lead helicopter was piloted by Major James Patterson, one of the most experienced aviators in the theater who had volunteered for the dangerous rescue mission. The SEAL team had successfully eliminated both missile sites, but Taliban reinforcements were approaching the area from multiple directions. Alpha Squad established defensive positions around the landing zone perimeter while maintaining communication with the rescue helicopters about enemy movements and threats. The extraction would need to be completed quickly before the security perimeter could be overwhelmed. Sarah's radio crackled with transmissions from Major Patterson as he began his approach to the landing zone. The pilot was requesting information about landing zone conditions, enemy threats, and the medical status of personnel requiring evacuation. Sarah provided detailed briefings based on her professional knowledge of helicopter operations and current tactical situation assessment. The first Black Hawk appeared over the ridgeline, flying low and fast to minimize exposure to potential ground fire. Major Patterson demonstrated exceptional skill as he maneuvered the aircraft into the confined landing zone, using every available foot of space while maintaining clearance from the rocky walls. The helicopter's rotor wash created a dust cloud that reduced visibility but also provided concealment from enemy observation. Medical personnel from the rescue helicopter immediately took charge of Thompson's care, connecting him to advanced life support equipment and beginning intravenous fluid replacement to counteract his blood loss. The flight medic reported that Thompson's vital signs were weak but stable, and that rapid evacuation to a military hospital would be necessary to save his life. Rodriguez and Johnson boarded the medical evacuation helicopter with Thompson, their portion of the rescue operation completed successfully. Sarah remained on the ground to coordinate the extraction of Alpha Squad and to provide intelligence about the tactical situation to the remaining rescue aircraft. Her responsibilities had evolved from pilot to ground commander during the course of the survival operation. The second Black Hawk landed as soon as the medical evacuation aircraft departed. Alpha Squad began boarding the rescue helicopter while maintaining security around the landing zone perimeter. Taliban fighters could be seen approaching from several directions, and small arms fire was beginning to impact near the helicopter's position. Sarah was among the last personnel to board the rescue aircraft, ensuring that all members of both her crew and the SEAL team were accounted for before leaving the landing zone. As she climbed into the helicopter, she took one final look at the wreckage of her Black Hawk, which had served faithfully until destroyed by enemy action. The aircraft had protected her crew during the crash, contributing to their survival through its robust design and safety systems. Major Patterson lifted off from the landing zone just as enemy forces reached positions where they could engage the helicopter with effective fire. Small arms rounds struck the aircraft's armored hull, but the defensive systems and pilots' evasive maneuvers prevented any critical damage. Within minutes, they were beyond the range of ground-based weapons and flying toward the safety of friendly territory. During the flight back to Bagram Air Base, Sarah reflected on the events that had transformed a routine extraction mission into a test of survival and leadership. Her Her crew had survived against overwhelming odds through training, teamwork, and determination. The experience had demonstrated that the boundaries between pilot, soldier, and leader could disappear when survival was at stake. The rescue operation's success was the result of multiple factors working together: the SEAL team's tactical expertise, the rescue pilot's exceptional skills, the medical personnel's life-saving abilities, and Sarah's leadership during the survival phase. Each element had been essential to bringing everyone home alive, proving that military operations succeed through the combined efforts of many dedicated professionals. The military hospital at Bagram Air Base was a stark contrast to the mountainous wilderness where Sarah and her crew had fought for survival just hours earlier. The sterile environment, bright fluorescent lighting, and constant activity of medical personnel created a surreal backdrop as Sarah sat in the waiting room, still wearing her torn and blood-stained flight suit, waiting for updates on Thompson's condition. The medical team had rushed Thompson into emergency surgery immediately upon arrival, working frantically to repair internal bleeding and stabilize his condition. Rodriguez had been treated for his concussion and multiple lacerations, requiring 16 stitches to close the head wound that had bled profusely during the crash and subsequent survival ordeal. Johnson had suffered minor injuries, but remained on duty to provide detailed reports about the mission and survival experience. Sarah found herself struggling with emotions she had never experienced during her military career. The weight of command responsibility, the near loss of crew members under her leadership, and the physical and psychological trauma of the crash and survival experience created a complex mixture of relief, guilt, and exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her normally controlled demeanor. The base commander, Colonel Patricia Williams, arrived at the hospital within an hour of the rescue helicopter's landing. Sarah stood to attention despite her disheveled appearance and obvious fatigue, but the colonel immediately ordered her to sit down and accept medical evaluation. The base's senior medical officer had recommended psychological counseling for all crew members, a standard procedure following traumatic combat experiences. News of the successful rescue operation had spread throughout the military community within hours of its completion. The dramatic nature of the helicopter shoot-down, crew survival, and coordinated rescue effort had captured the attention of senior leadership at multiple levels, from theater commanders to Pentagon officials. Sarah found herself at the center of media attention she had never sought and was uncomfortable receiving. The initial military investigation into the incident began immediately, with investigators examining the helicopter wreckage, interviewing crew members, and analyzing intelligence reports about enemy capabilities in the area. The presence of sophisticated surface-to-air missile systems represented a significant escalation in Taliban capabilities that had implications for future flight operations throughout Afghanistan. Thompson emerged from surgery after 4 hours in the operating room. The surgical team reported that they had successfully repaired internal bleeding and stabilized his condition, though his recovery would require several weeks of hospitalization, followed by extensive rehabilitation. The flight surgeon credited the crew's first aid efforts and rapid evacuation with saving Thompson's life, noting that any additional delay would likely have been fatal. Sarah's debriefing sessions with intelligence officers lasted for several days as investigators sought to understand every detail about the attack and survival experience. Her pilot's training in observation and situational awareness proved invaluable in providing accurate information about enemy tactics, weapon systems, and locations that could be used to prevent similar incidents in the future. The SEAL team members from Alpha Squad visited Sarah and her crew during their recovery period, expressing gratitude for the extraction mission that had ultimately led to their own rescue. The Special Operations personnel had high praise for Sarah's leadership during the survival situation and her coordination of the rescue operation from the ground. Their professional respect meant more to Sarah than any official recognition she might receive. Rodriguez recovered quickly from his concussion and was cleared to return to flight duty within 2 weeks of the incident. However, he expressed concerns about his confidence in flying similar missions, particularly regarding his ability to make split-second decisions under combat conditions. The flight surgeon recommended extended psychological counseling to address post-traumatic stress that could affect his performance and safety. Johnson's experience during the survival and rescue operation led to her recommendation for promotion and transfer to a special operations medical unit. Her performance under extreme conditions had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded her current assignment, and senior medical personnel recognized her potential for more challenging roles within the military medical community. The investigation into the helicopter's shoot-down revealed significant intelligence failures that had contributed to the crew's exposure to enemy missile systems. Reports about Taliban capabilities in the target area had been incomplete and outdated, failing to identify the presence of sophisticated weapons that posed serious threats to coalition aircraft. The findings led to changes in intelligence collection and analysis procedures. Sarah received notification that she was being considered for the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the military's highest awards for extraordinary achievement in aerial flight. The recommendation cited her exceptional piloting skills during the missile attack, her successful crash landing that saved crew members' lives, and her leadership during the survival and rescue operation. She felt conflicted about receiving recognition for what she considered simply doing her job under difficult circumstances. The psychological impact of the experience affected each crew member differently. Sarah found herself having vivid nightmares about the crash and survival experience, often waking up in cold sweats with her heart racing. The base psychologist explained that post-traumatic stress reactions were normal following such intense combat experiences, and that professional counseling could help her process the trauma effectively. Media attention surrounding the incident focused heavily on Sarah's role as one of the few female helicopter pilots in combat roles. Reporters wanted to emphasize the gender barrier aspects of her story, but Sarah preferred to focus on the professional performance of her entire crew and the rescue personnel who had risked their lives to save them. She felt uncomfortable with the attention and preferred to remain focused on her military duties. Thompson's recovery progressed steadily, though doctors warned that he might never regain full use of his injured arm and shoulder. The extent of nerve damage would not be fully known until months of rehabilitation had been completed, and there was a possibility that his military career could be ended by the injuries sustained during the crash. He remained positive about his prognosis and grateful to be alive. The Taliban forces responsible for the helicopter attack were tracked down and eliminated by coalition forces within 2 weeks of the incident. The special operations mission that destroyed the enemy cell also recovered intelligence about other surface-to-air missile systems that had been smuggled into Afghanistan. The information led to the interdiction of additional weapons shipments and the disruption of Taliban supply networks. Sarah's squadron held a formal ceremony to recognize the crew's survival and rescue, with presentations by senior officers and representatives from the SEAL team that had participated in the operation. The event provided closure for the traumatic experience while acknowledging the professional performance of everyone involved. Thompson attended the ceremony in a wheelchair, still recovering from his injuries, but determined to show his support for his fellow crew members. The lessons learned from the incident were incorporated into training programs for helicopter crews throughout the theater of operations. Sarah participated in developing new survival and evasion procedures based on her firsthand experience, helping other aircrew prepare for similar situations. Her technical expertise and practical knowledge contributed to training programs that could save lives in future emergencies. 6 months after the incident, Sarah was promoted to major and assigned to a training position at the Army Aviation Center of Excellence in the United States. The assignment would allow her to share her combat experience with the next generation of military helicopter pilots while providing time for her to recover from the psychological trauma of her Afghanistan deployment. She looked forward to the opportunity to contribute to aviation safety and crew survival training. Thompson was medically retired from active duty due to his injuries, but he remained connected to the military aviation community through his work with veterans organizations. His experience during the crash and survival situation had given him new perspectives on the importance of crew training and aircraft safety systems. He frequently spoke at safety conferences about survival procedures and crew resource management. Rodriguez continued flying combat missions for the remainder of his deployment, though he voluntarily participated in additional psychological counseling to address his post-traumatic stress symptoms. His experience with Sarah's crew had reinforced his respect for the professionalism and capabilities of female military pilots, changing his previous assumptions about women in combat roles. Johnson completed her deployment and accepted promotion to a Special Operations Medical Unit, where her skills and experience could be utilized in the most challenging military medical situations. Her performance during the survival and rescue operation had demonstrated exceptional competence under pressure and opened new career opportunities within the special operations community. The story of Sarah Mitchell and her crew's survival became part of military aviation lore, studied in classrooms and discussed in ready rooms throughout the armed forces. Their experience demonstrated that survival in combat depends not only on individual training and equipment, but also on leadership, teamwork, and the determination to never give up in the face of overwhelming odds. Years later, when Sarah looked back on that day in the mountains of Afghanistan, she realized that the experience had fundamentally changed her understanding of herself and her capabilities. The young pilot who had volunteered for combat deployment to prove her abilities had discovered that heroism was not about individual achievement, but about taking care of the people who depended on her leadership. The question asked by the SEALs that day, who brought down that helicopter, had been answered not just by identifying the enemy responsible, but by revealing the strength and determination of the pilot who had brought her crew home alive.